So we're also going to do a very unstructured rim class a little bit. It'll be like jazz, something like that. So my name's Soren Aldal. I run Berkeley Capital and also decided to be a sadist to teach a class at the University of Texas School on fraud management.
And I'm Jim Chanos, president founder of Chanos & Co., formerly Kinnikos Associates. And I'm excited to be here. I'm thrilled that we have Oxford across the pond participating, and should be a fun day. So why don't you kick it off?
Let's kick it off. All right. So Jim, for the people that don't know, what's like the ethos? Like, what's the elevator pitch for your class that a student's going to hear when they take it?
So when I began teaching the course 12 years ago, Rick Levin, who was president of Yale, was excited, but he kind of grabbed me before the first week of class and said, "You're not going to teach them how to commit fraud, are you?" And I said, "Well, hopefully not, but they should have some of the tools. It works both ways." The ethos of the class that I teach, and I teach it at both the Yale School of Management and at the University of Wisconsin School of Business, is really structured around a series of models. It's a systematic approach. I do want to give the students tools to identify various aspects of fraud in their future endeavors. But we combine it with a historical narrative and cases. So we begin with the first Ipo Bubble, which contained a lot of frauds in the late 17th century. I know a lot of you are probably not familiar with that, but this goes back well past 300 and some years. We then go on to the Mississippi scheme and South Sea frauds, and then right on into the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. But the crucial aspect are the 5 models. One is a macro model, which we look, and basically the idea is that the fraud cycle follows the business cycle and financial cycle with a lag. That as financial and business cycles get elongated, people's sense of disbelief erodes, and they begin to believe things that are too good to be true. I think what we're seeing in the last couple of years is a really good real-time example of that. And so once the cycles turn down, not only are frauds discovered, because generally most of them are Ponzi schemes of some sort or another, but also the public begins to get angry as opposed to believing. Once they start losing money, the public demands action. And one of the things that in my research I've discovered is that the political environment has a lot to do with what happens to the fraudsters and what happens to legislation and regulation after waves of fraud. Sometimes the public just shrugs, and sometimes they want heads on spikes. The second model is a micro model, which is looking at the actual enterprise, the corporation typically itself, where we call it the fraud triangle. It's a well-established model. The pressure to commit fraud, the opportunity, and the rationalization. And then we move on into a governance model, which comes from Professor Bill Black, who was a banking regulator in the S&L crisis. It's a control fraud model, whereby we examine how fraudsters use the corporate structure as both a weapon and a shield, using the structure to enrich themselves, and then using the corporate structure to protect themselves. A lot of relevance to a lot of modern day frauds. The next one is straight from a good friend of ours, for many in the room, Bethany McLean, who dubbed the term legal fraud, and I stole it shamelessly and built a model around it. And the idea there is, and again, this is really applicable to a lot of modern situations, is everything the company does is legal, but yet there is an intent to deceive. And Enron fit that model perfectly. Everything got signed off. I often joke that financial crimes, unlike crimes of passion and crimes of opportunity, come with the alibis built in. And you know, this model really covers that. And then the final model is a checklist The 7 Signs of Ethical Collapse is our textbook there, and it's a series of attributes that many frauds have had down through history. And it's shocking how many frauds, particularly, again, in modern cases, have fit 5 or 6 or all 7 of the attributes of the 7 Signs of Ethical Collapse from Marianne Jennings. So those are the models, and the idea is, again, to give the students a toolbox with some use of cases, both historical and more recent, to say, okay, if this comes across my career path, I ought to say something, or I ought to do something. So, what's going on in Texas? Tell me how you're.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think there's this misconception when students take the course, they sign up for it, that they're going to learn how to be a short seller. That's like the opposite of what we teach. The first thing I say is definitely do not become a short seller. And you can probably
Good advice.
right. You'll probably hear that a lot today. Just get out there and mingle in the conference. But it's, they're more likely to become a fraudster than they are to be a successful short seller. And what the, through the historical frameworks that I try and teach, and just full disclosure, our course, or the course that I taught teaches, is shamelessly modeled on Jim's, like to the point where when I was just getting into short selling, I was unhappy young lawyer not too far from here in Kirkland and Ellis. And I was like, well, how do I learn about this? One of the things that was going around back then was Jim's syllabus and it wasn't uncommon as, not just people in the course, but people that are looking to try and understand how the market and the frameworks and some of these historical examples work, to just kind of go through the syllabus, see these examples. And that's a little flavor of what I wanted to bring to the University of Texas. But, for us, what's interesting is that there's that mythology that we're going to teach you how to short sell, or that's what the course is going to be about. Absolutely not. Like the idea is basically to equip these students with the mental models to essentially avoid landmines in their personal life. Like the idea that they can recognize these things real time. If they're an auditor, they can see it among their clients. If they're interviewing for a job, or they're at a company that is, particularly questionable, they're equipped with the models in order to detect and think about these things that happen in the capital markets. And then also for their 401ks, hopefully avoid a few landmines over the years. But I think what's fascinating about it is also, I've only been teaching it for 2 years, and I've been teaching it in the era of nihilism. I've been teaching it in the era of Wall Street bets. So from my experience, it's probably completely different a little bit than yours, because it used to be the idea that the investing heroes, the champions that you put up were people like Warren Buffett. There's fundamental values to companies, and once you identify those fundamental values, you can profit from them. What's fascinating about the students that I've encountered over the last couple of years is that paradigm has completely shifted. No longer is it a matter of detecting fraud. Fraud isn't the hard part to detect. The hard part is that they are witnessing in their investing lives their friends get rich off of not only just not detecting frauds, but affirmatively detecting frauds and investing long in them. It was a profitable investment strategy, which is a complete paradigm shift than perhaps what you sort of experienced over the cycle.
So when I started the course in 2010, obviously what was on everybody's mind was the GFC, and how did this happen, and what was the evidence of fraud, and then as the next few years handled, why was it never really prosecuted, and that became kind of a central theme. But of course, as you allude to, as 12 years has passed, we began to see things like Valiant, we began to see things like Wirecard, we began to see things like Theranos. And I was able to work those in real time with some of the classes. For example, my class last fall at Wisconsin, we were tracking the Theranos trial of Elizabeth Holmes real time. And one of the final exam questions was, and there had not been a verdict yet by the second week of December, was, we've been following the Theranos trial very closely, would you convict as a juror, and if so, why? And I was proud of my students.
What was the percentage that's
96% would have convicted.
Yeah.
And they convicted because of the document trail, the testimony to the fortune writer, you know, a number of pretty much what I thought were pretty open and shut type pieces of evidence.
The text message to Sunny calling him her moon and stars, that was pretty bad too.
And so, so lately we've seen that, but I would agree, Soren. Obviously we've been talking about crypto for the last few years and some of the nefarious stuff going on there. And I've seen interestingly more pushback from my MBA students on some of the things we're talking about in terms of the contemporaneous cases. You know, like, well, the stock price is up a lot.
Yeah.
And I said, you know, that's true. But my experience is if you're confronted with evidence of fraud and a stock price that's doing well, it's the evidence of fraud that will maintain its historical accuracy. Stock prices fluctuate. And so there's no doubt that maybe until this past spring, that the student body, the MBAs, and more of them are going off to work in areas where we're seeing areas of wrongdoing, have gotten a lot more comfortable with the idea, like, well, yeah, but you could have said that 5 years ago and the stock's up a lot, or this or that, and begin to rationalize what might be really
Like,
kind of obvious.
okay,
behavior.
boomer. Okay, boomer, right?
Yeah, well, that comes with the territory. Explain to me a little bit, when your students, are you teaching MBAs or?
Yeah, I teach MBAs, and just like something in parallel. So we teach the Elizabeth Holmes module, and my first year ever teaching the course was while the verdict was right prior to the verdict handed down. And I asked the students, we did a class poll of how many people thought she was guilty, and the answer was about 95%, similar. But the more interesting poll that we did was, despite the fact that you all think that she's guilty, how many of the students do you think will actually, do you think that she'll serve time? And the answer was 10%. 10% thought that despite the fact that she committed fraud, she was highly unlikely to ever face punishment. And then when we asked the class, you know, what sentence will she get? I was actually the only one that said she would probably get more than 5 years. So, you know, in my quarterly updates to my past class, I dunk on them all the time on that. But I think that just goes to show, like, you know, where we are in the cycle in terms of up and coming MBA students, and, you know, how they're viewing the world is that despite the fact that they saw that, like, there's demonstrable evidence of fraud existing, that they simply did not believe that she would be punished. And I think what's fascinating about that is, you know, you started teaching after the GFC. Short selling and fraud detection was having a moment. Like, Christian Bale played a short seller in a movie. Like, that's great. Like, now it seems that, like, the pendulum has shifted despite the fact that there's just widespread, you know, I would say even, you know, to shamelessly steal your line, the golden age of fraud today. It seems that, like, fraud detection and short selling is vilified in a way that really wasn't coming out of the GFC. You know, what do you think about that? Like, do you notice that in terms of your experience, your teaching, your interacting experience with the students?
Well, I would point out that pre-GFC, the short seller was the key villain in the first Bond that Daniel Craig did.
It's true. Yeah.
And
he was too activist.
So yeah. So it gets back to the point I make that these things actually follow the financial cycle, and I know I see a number of sort of fellow travelers in the audience, Jim Carruthers and Andrew and others. I mean, you have to remember that in the late 90s, this was a pretty, you know, that looking for fraud in the late 90s, and there was already a number of situations like CUC International, Boston Chicken, whatever, that presaged the dot-com blow-ups in the Enron, WorldComs, and Tycos. And, you know, people looked askance at it then, not maybe as much as they did in the last 2 years. It wasn't until the public lost a lot of money that they again began clamoring for authorities to do something, and so I think that it really is, and that goes way back, goes back to the 17th century. The idea of these waves of public indignation over corporate wrongdoing. One of the interesting things, though, that we've had some fun with, that is kind of relevant, that speaking of going back to the way back, is talking about one of my favorite characters in all of financial history and financial fraud, who is really the kind of also the father of modern fiat currency, John Law, and to talk about his thinking about money as it relates to fiat, as it relates to crypto, and tying in one of the greatest financial criminals of all time into the discussion on cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology. And it's fascinating to think that a guy that wrote a pamphlet on Money and Trade Considered in 1705 would still be relevant to the discussion about fiat and its shortcomings and its strengths versus cryptocurrency. The fact that he then turned out to be, arguably the greatest financial criminal of all time makes it even kind of more interesting. But we try to tie that in as much as we can on the historical narrative and the cases, which are fun to teach. Yeah, we were chatting in the green room right before this, and I always point out that some of the greatest endeavors of all time were basically accomplished by fraudsters. The Transcontinental Railroad was built by Union Pacific Credit Mobilier, which was the Enron of the 19th century. MCI WorldCom built out most of the internet backbone. It was a massive fraud. And so these kinds of historical cases try to bring it up to relevance to the students to make them understand that it's not everything's not necessarily a Theranos where there may or may not have been anything there, that in fact legitimate enterprises can commit fraud and really ruin people's lives. And those cases help teach that.
I think the tenor of the entire class is at this time it's not different. That like the models, what we see today, like the very actors that people point to as sort of imprimaturs of authority, those that are supposedly not only detecting fraud in the market, but there as a prophylactic to prevent them, have just consistently failed throughout the history of the financial markets, and in fact are disincentivized and ill-equipped to do so. And it's just, it's a bit of history on repeat, and that's what's fun about it. How has teaching this helped you in your investment life? Right. Do you think it's sharpened your ability to sort of like detect? Do you think it's?
Well, first of all, I've hired some of my best students, so that's a plus from a recruiting point of view. And then historically, we've always asked in a final exam question, and the students know this. I mean, the word gets around. I always ask them to write up something that they think fits our models currently that we haven't discussed in class, and I've gotten some great ideas from that.
Yeah.
but really, I think that over time the course has evolved. I have to say, there's a number of people in this room that have helped do that. We've brought in amazing guest lectures. I mean, one of our cases is Ivar Kruger, the Match King, and who better to discuss the Match King, but Professor Frank Portnoy, who's been a friend of the class, and we've had Judge Rakoff come in and discuss the concepts of fraud upon the market and other great ideas, and people like Bethany McLean, Jesse Eisinger, others who just bring their expertise to the class and really take it up a few notches. We've even brought in this year someone on the whole GameStop and was it securities fraud, was it trading fraud, and so again we try to keep it as relevant as we can, and bring it up to speed. But again, I think that having the historical benefit and seeing and opening up the students' eyes to the fact that this has happened before, in different guises and different techniques and technologies, but human behavior doesn't change. People have been defrauding themselves
basically since the beginning.
Since the beginning of time, and in financial markets since the beginning of modern financial markets.
Yeah. Have you had a student, so I guess like if you hired your students, hopefully this is true, but have you had a student yet kind of go on to detect
Yes.
a major
Yes.
fraud?
Yeah.
Like in the,
Yeah.
Was this proud filial piety?
I've so far had one student in one of my, she was, I think 2011 or 2012, and I got an email from her a few years after graduation, and she said she wanted to thank me because she was working in the comptroller's office for a Fortune 500 company that shall go unnamed. Based on the models in the class, she began to get suspicious of one of the divisions that was reporting to the office, that the numbers just didn't look right. The questions that they asked, they were not getting the right answers from the line managers. And when they went in internally, they found fraud. And so, you know, it was I don't want to be excited that yes, there was fraud at a Fortune 500 company that never got disclosed, because it hasn't been disclosed. But on the other hand, I felt like, okay, well, I think I'm teaching the tools that are helping students exactly, because they're not going to be short sellers, or you want them, however, if these are our future business leaders or agency leaders, whether profit or nonprofit, fraud is going to cross your path at some point in your career. And you don't want that which you're responsible for to be harmed, or your own career to be harmed, or your portfolio to be harmed, what have you. It's going to cross your career at some point. That's inevitable. So
You must be I think you're probably a better professor than I am, because the only thing that I think I've successfully created was one Cassandra that I know of. So one of the students that I was teaching went to take a job at an accounting firm, and he had just come out of the class, and he emails me about 3 months afterwards, and he's like, look, like, I'm on the verge of getting canned here because every time an invoice doesn't match, I'm like, I think it's fraud. And I'm like, you can't. It's like, no. The frameworks only apply to like a small sliver of the financial markets here.
Yeah.
You got to pump the brakes a little, buddy.
Not all errors are fraud.
Exactly.
Yeah. Maybe 5 minutes to take questions. I think in the 5 or 6 or 7 minutes we have left. Corey. Take it first.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it. I think it's, you know, for me, it's also like a larger, you know, especially in the time that I decided to start teaching it, was a time when the notion that there was, you know, the detecting fraud, that the notion of dissenting opinions in the capital markets were very unpopular. And I felt that there was like a real, that there's good that comes from putting out in the ether the idea that like these frameworks, that the people that detect fraud, the people that can identify it, the people that can warn others about it, are not only incredibly valuable in the economic cycle, but also valuable to sort of, there's a broader societal value, no matter whether you're a short seller, whether you're a comptroller. And that was almost like the, you know, kind of putting that intellectual energy out there in whatever form it, you know, it eventually took was pretty important for me.
Yeah. So again, I'd amplify what Soren's saying, that 90+% of what modern business school students learn is to emulate success, whether through, you know, systematic learning, case studies, what have you, and that's fine. But we also know that fraud is widespread. I kick off my class every year with the survey that I found sitting one summer in East Hampton, like, you know, in flip-flops and cargo shorts. In 1998, I was thumbing through a Business Week magazine, and that's a really old statement, but anyway, there was one of those tear-out inserts. Those of you that are like above 60 know what I'm talking about. Anyway, and it was S&P, McGraw-Hill owned S&P and Business Week at the time. And S&P had a conference for the S&P 500 CFOs. And in the back of this little, you know, rundown of the conference, they said, oh, and we had a set of survey questions. And the one that caught my eye was they asked these CFOs from the S&P 500, there were a few hundred of them in attendance, have you ever been asked by your immediate superior to commit material fraud. Again, I'm paraphrasing the question, but it was 55% said yes, they had been asked but didn't do it. 12% said they had been asked and did it, and 33% said no or no answer. And I sort of thought about that for a second and said, gee, 2/3 of the C-suite senior people have asked their CFOs to commit some sort of material fraud. That's a big deal, right? That tells you how much agency risk is in business. And someone needs to address that. And by the way, there was the similar, just to lest you think that was a one-off, there was a similar survey the very next December in CFO magazine that had very similar results. And then there's been a subsequent question where it was slightly less bad about 3 or 4 years ago in an academic survey. So yeah, I mean, I think this is a need that business schools need to teach. I'm never a big fan of teaching ethics. I think ethics are something you kind of have to learn very early on. But learning the tools and learning, you know, and the models, I think, is really, really helpful. So yeah, that's really the idea behind it.
Hi, I'm Anat Mati. I'm from Stanford, and I teach not quite financial fraud. I teach power in finance, and I bring short sellers and a bunch of people who are here, regular visitors. Now, the accounting class took Bethany McLean, so she comes, burnt them for my class, but Jesse and Judge Rakoff, and we hosted regularly a short seller, Fahmi Kadir. We talk a lot about Wirecard and all of that. My point, and I teach undergrads as well, so again, I am not about ethics, I'm about savvy. So the way I frame it also, because my interaction with legal fraud is by lobbying and saying nonsense to policymakers and that kind of strategy in the political sphere where you get away. So I just wanted to make more of a comment that that it's really some of what you're talking about, you didn't say the word, is sort of savvy and kind of how does it really work. I also asked my students this past winter quarter, MBAs, how many of them have encountered fraud, and it was a very high number in their lives. Those that were in finance, my course is called Power in Finance, and it's taken by non-finance people who come from completely other places. But anyway, I just thought I'd make the comment.
Sure. So have you guys ever encountered anything external, like legislation or, well, I guess legislation, judicial sentences that have negatively impacted the commitment of like fraud, you know, jail sentences post WorldCom and Enron,
Oh, interesting, yeah.
GFC, Dodd-Frank, I'm sure put the fear of Jesus into a lot of people. I'm joking.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably, I don't want to step on, you know, Judge Rakoff's toes, who's going to come a little bit later. That's a really good question about the deterrence impact of sort of white collar punishment on, you know, there's an argument to be made that this sort of fraud is the most eminently deterrable type of fraud because people are doing it typically for financial reward or some variety, you know, sometimes it's ego, but a lot of times it is financial reward. So the notion that like significant punishments can, you know, deter the next generation of business leaders, you know, I think there's a lot of validity to that. You know, I got my start in this whole business because I was an intern at the U.S. Attorney's Office working for the AUSAs doing Jeff Skilling's prosecution. And they had mentioned to me that there was this guy out in New York, Jim Chanos, who does exactly what we do. He just gets paid a little bit better. So, but it's 100%, I think, the case that the deterrence impact of some of these things, and I think we're starting to see that because I think in the last 15 to 20 years, like Judge Rakoff's like primary point is that, you know, white collar crime has been significantly under prosecuted. The expertise is not there anymore. And arguably, we've seen that play out in the financial markets with the level of fraud of the last few years. Jim, what do you think?
Yeah, and as you know, the cases are hard to prosecute. And so prosecutors, I think, you know, Jesse Eisinger's written a book about this concept, but it does seem to me that when we see actual criminal prosecutions that result in jail time, you do see a fall off before the next cycle. Legislation and regulation, a little bit squishier. I remember getting a phone call after the Enron era when Sarbanes-Oxley was passed. And I got a phone call from an enterprising young reporter at a major news outlet. And she said, well, what are you going to do for the rest of your life? What do you mean? She said, well, they've made fraud illegal. I think I'll be okay. Health South happened about a week after that phone call. So, yeah,
Well,
I'm sorry. Okay, yeah, that's fine.
any final words, and then we'll wrap it up?
I think we'll turn it back to you, Frank.
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. We could go for another hour listening to all of you. So